So, I mean, this is the first example in history of a state organization, whatever, that has successfully instituted a naval blockade without a standing navy. I mean, militaries are expensive. Navies are the most expensive part of any military historically. And naval blockades are only accomplished by the most advanced militaries, right? And because they're so expensive, they're resource intensive, you need supply lines that are continuous, etc. And the reason they were able to do it was threefold. It's because of a geographic choke point, in part, because the Bab al-Mandeb Strait is very narrow, and it's the connection between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. And so it's this crucial choke point in global trade. 30% of all container ships travel through there, 12% of all oil and gas, so it's a huge choke point that is potential for high disruption. The second point is that they had access to domestically produced ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. Some of them were dual use that they purchased from China and that were transported through Oman, and then they sort of recalibrated them as primarily surveillance drones. But the second part was that direct support from Iran was able to make and produce basically a bunker buster proof deep underground facility in Saida, and there they were able to produce these sort of domestically produced drones and missiles. And so because of that, they were able to attack quite effectively. And the last part is because of the changing composition of maritime capitalism. And there's this sort of underlying law of motion that Marx describes in Volume 1 of Capital, which is one of competition. That intensity of competition leads to centralization. So the consolidation of the shipping industry, which now basically 9 or 10 shipping companies and 3 alliances control 90% of all shipping, global shipping. And that's resulted in very efficient production processes, massive ships. So for example, in the 1980s, they had the largest ship was 4,500 TEUs. That's 20 equivalent unit. That's basically a unit measure for shipping containers, how much they can carry. Now it's 5 times that. And those ships are massive because they're more efficient, and you have higher profits. And these alliances mean that you can be very efficient. You have low slack. Slack is the amount of space you have for any delays. The slack is very slim. So that's highly profitable, but it means that disruptions have reverberating effects across the supply chain. It also means that, for example, historically, Israel, so-called, had 6 ports that, goods can come out of in the 70s and 80s. That now it's basically 2 deep water ports, one at Ashdod and one at Haifa, and then 3 sort of what you call sort of commercial hub ports. And that was Eilat, which is the only one that's tied to the Red Sea, and Ashdod and Haifa. Eilat basically declares bankruptcy because of the Red Sea blockade. They're able to stop them continuously because they're sending these missiles, and it's no longer commercially viable for Maersk or other major firms, shipping firms, to transport the goods because the liabilities went through the roof. Liabilities means typically it would be sort of 0.1% of the goods of a shipping container would be paid into insurance. It shot up to 2%. That's 2,000% increase, right? That's a massive. When you have relatively low margins and you're intensely competitive, it's a massive upshot. So they instead took the hit and said, okay, we're going to transport around. We're going to go back to by 150 years before the Suez was built and transport around Southern Africa, increased by 2 weeks. That increases oil prices, increase costs in terms of transport, in terms of crew, in terms of everything, in order to get it to Israel and get it to Europe, etc. So you had a massive impact across the supply chain. Goods go up, inflation could shoot up, loads of factors involved in this. And because of the consolidation of these systems, it meant that these massive ships over time could only dock in these deep water ports. Because the draft, which is where the front of the ship hits the bottom of the hull, the draft increases as these ships become bigger and bigger. And there's only a few ports that can absorb them. And so because it's only Ashdod and Haifa, as soon as Eilat is shut down, the capacity becomes bigger and bigger in Haifa and Ashdod. And because of that, you see Hezbollah were attacking Haifa continuously. You saw Iran responding to Israel's aggression, attacking Haifa and successfully hitting Haifa. And it's important to remember the reason why Israel begins to create their missile defense system for short-term missiles, which is the Iron Dome, longer-term missiles, obviously David Sling, others. But for short-term missiles was precisely because they said it was a horror scenario, inverted commas, horror scenario of what happened in 2006 when Hezbollah successfully defeated the entity and attacked Haifa. And because they attacked Haifa and were able to shut down Haifa, they were like, this is a horror scenario. We have to stop this. Because Israel is essentially an island state. 99.6% of all its goods in and out are seaborne. And because of that, that's a crucial liability. And so that's why when Iran consciously and deliberately attacked Haifa, major shipping companies like Maersk said we are no longer, and they're the main shipping company that transports arms to Israel, said that we're going to move to Ashdod. Ashdod doesn't have nearly the capacity of Haifa. So you have this massive backlog, very low slack. They have to wait to dock their ships. So these increase the liability to the state. And so the impacts of what the Ansar Allah have been able to successfully do, even in defeating the imperialist forces. So you had this coalition of 20 countries, 6 of them that didn't even want to be named. The mission was called Prosperity Guardian. That was done under Biden. Totally unsuccessful because you have these huge, like massive fleets, expensive, transporters, etc. And you have these movable rebels. Historically, the problem with rebel armies and major armies that in that asymmetry is that the question of distance. So if you look at the revolutionary forces in Vietnam, for example, they're very dynamic. They can move around. But the problem is they can't make up distance. They have to come very close because they don't have air power. And so that's where the liabilities are. Whereas here, they can make up that distance because they have these now more affordable technologies and because of the help they got from Iran. So so they weren't able to defeat them. And then it's more indicative of this. And that's why in many ways, Trump is more useful as a kind of against imperialism than someone like Biden. Trump didn't even try to get a coalition together. Of course, their lapdog Britain followed suit. Probably he didn't even ask them to, and he did. Starmer did. But they also were defeated. And it's very clear in the New York Times piece that came out in April, very, very clear. The Pentagon was like, we've sent $1 billion in a very short period of time and had almost no impact on Ansar Allah because they were so dynamic. And we're losing all of our missiles. We don't have enough strategic precision-guided missiles in case something happens with China and Taiwan. They say this explicitly. So that's why that was very clearly a defeat. And Trump signs that agreement without even speaking to Israel. It's very clear that he did that. So long story short, Ansar Allah were successful because of their commitment and solidarity and a revolutionary consciousness, but also because they were able to see the changing material conditions of maritime capitalism and exploit them very efficaciously.